Hi everyone, this is the first of a series of videos that I've promised on being an English major and skills that might be useful to you that you may already be familiar with but may not for whatever reason. This one is a really foundational video on the idea of academic mindset, and it's really based on the idea of academic values and norms that often are a set of invisible rules or unspoken rules that your professors are going to be expecting of you and your work. But because your professors have probably internalized these rules possibly decades ago, very frequently, your professors will often think of these rules more as kind of common sense. They may have forgotten having had to learn them, and it may be hard for them to remember that actually these are things that have to be learned. From the student's point of view, these very same rules can often feel very arbitrary, and they're often learned, if learned at all, sort of in the breach. So the way that students often experience these is these are ideas that aren't necessarily explicitly taught, but you notice them when someone tells you you've done something wrong. And I think this is one of the ways that, especially when you first enter college, college can be extremely alienating and sometimes really upsetting because you've done the preparing that you've done to get to college. You may have a really good academic record, and then you get here and then suddenly everything you seem to do is wrong, but nobody is necessarily telling you why. Or if they do, they may even have trouble articulating why it's wrong. They may just feel somehow that you should have known. But the reality is, like any kind of norm, they're learned, right? This is learned behavior, and there's absolutely no reason that you should know this before you get here. Nobody comes out of the womb right? Sharing academic values, and norms come from the values of a community. So the first thing I want to point out here is that academia, this kind of academic community that we have, it is a community, right? And one of its basic foundations is this kind of set of shared values. Understanding that there are these shared values and that's where our norms come from, even if you haven't internalized those values yet, or even if you ever do, understanding what those values are and then understanding what those norms are can really help you then to anticipate and perform those norms in order to improve your work and improve your grades. It also can help make those standards that your professors expect seem a lot less arbitrary. There is a kind of logic behind them. So I just want to kind of pull back the curtain a little bit so that you understand that what that is. I'd also like to kind of extend compassion on both sides of that line. Your professors aren't trying to deliberately give you invisible barriers. It's just really hard for them to remember that this isn't, of course, some kind of universal standard. For many of them, it's been decades since they've learned this, but also for students, it's extremely upsetting to go through this process, especially if they aren't given a kind of guiding hand. So with all of that as a kind of introduction, let's actually get into it. Academia, it's a community. It has a set of values, and as with any community, values lead to norms. And so I'm going to share an image with you. It's very exciting with my advanced imaging here. Values lead to norms, okay? And so what we need to do in any case when we're thinking about the relationship between values and norms, for the norms to make sense, we need to understand what the values are, where a community is coming from, what's important to them. So what's important to know for this community is our values, right? Okay, so our central value is really easy. It's literally one, except it's made up of a bit of a contradiction. Academia is said to be open-minded, but skeptical. So you can already see a kind of tension there. What does it mean to be open-minded, but skeptical? The kind of way that I tend to think of this is, we will entertain a claim, but we require verifiable and persuasive evidence before we will think that that claim is justifiable or valid within this community. Now, to be fair, what is considered persuasive evidence is probably going to differ from discipline to discipline. So what's considered persuasive evidence in a physics class is not going to be the same evidence that would be persuasive in a literature class. But both of those disciplines require a claim to be supported by the evidence that would be persuasive in that venue. So I hope that makes sense. Now, that may seem really, really basic, but if you think about this kind of sense that you will listen to almost any kind of claim or proposal, but it needs to be backed up by evidence that is considered valid within whatever discipline you are arguing, actually has really profound effects on what you are doing throughout any kind of claim-based work, assignment, writing at really any level, undergraduate, graduate, postgraduate level work in academia, particularly, and this will be important to you here, but also in other classes, when you're writing something, okay? So it actually has profound effects at every level of a writing project, which we'll talk about presently. So let's talk about what that means. Okay, so first of all, this value is manifest in a particular type of argumentative structure we call an enthymeme. And an enthymeme is an extremely simple two-part structure that is made up of a claim and the idea of why should I or any reasonable person believe that claim, okay? So to think about that, again, what counts as evidence is going to be different from field to field to field, but the value or the expectation, that norm that when someone makes a claim, immediately thereafter, the first thing someone would expect is that you're going to produce the goods, you're going to show the receipts, you're going to show your homework, you're going to show that there is evidence for that claim. That expectation is the same across the board. Now, again, what counts as evidence is going to be different. In some fields, personal account is going to be more persuasive than others. In all fields, they're also going to want, or primarily going to want, cited research or cited evidence. And the reason why cited evidence is kind of the gold standard is that means it's something that someone else can check up on. They can look at your citation and actually verify your evidence. The personal account can only attest to so much or go so far, right? And the personal account is also depending quite a bit on the trust of your audience that what you're saying is true, because the buck kind of stops with you, right? Where if there's cited research, they can also look up the sort of credentials of the person. They can also see the evidence. And that's one of the nice things about cited research is they can see, or a cited source is they can not only see the quote that you refer to, but they can look at it in its context if they want to know more about the original thing that you're looking at. Okay, so that's usually the kind of gold standard of what usually in academia they're going to be looking at, much more so than personal account. There are some exceptions to that, of course. If you've got like a first person interviews, you'll sometimes see that in psychology, right? Or surveys. You will sometimes see first person accounts in kind of like political situations to kind of, figure out what's going on in a very kind of immediate situation. You will also see in particular disciplines where there's less representation because of discrimination or disproportionate valuation of individuals in a community. You'll see very frequently in studies that are devoted to those disadvantaged groups, you'll often see that the personal account is often seen as a kind of corrective to the silencing of disadvantaged voices. But that kind of use of evidence is often seen as a kind of corrective to what is often seen as academic bias. Okay, so maybe getting a little bit into the weeds here, but generally, but even when you have something like an interview, you have to kind of cite exactly the circumstances, who, what, when, where. You can't just kind of say, oh yeah, one time I was talking to this person. Okay, all right, so that's kind of getting into the weeds a little bit. But basically, generally you are going to want to have a claim, and you can't just kind of let that claim sit there. You can't just say, I believe. That's not evidence. In academia, you have to say, here's the claim, and here's the evidence that should persuade you of that claim. I don't expect you to take it on faith in me. Here's the evidence. Even better if you can show a pattern of evidence. Okay, so in the different ways that we can see this, we can actually see the sort of knockdown effects of that norm, of that expectation, all over in the structures that you're going to be working with in your text, especially if we're dealing with evidence-based, argument-based work. So most of your papers, not only in English courses, but in other courses. So for example, let's go back to sharing screens. You know, your body, your paper is itself an enthymeme. So if you think about the structure at the macro level of a paper, your thesis is the claim. The entire body of your paper is answering the question, why should I or any reasonable person believe that thesis? Okay, so you can think of your entire paper as an enthymeme. Anything in your paper that isn't contributing to answering that second question is actually not appropriately part of your paper. Okay, at the more micro level, every single body paragraph of your paper is an enthymeme. It is a topic sentence level claim, first sentence of the body paragraph. The rest of your body paragraph is answering that question. Why should I or any reasonable person believe that claim, that topic sentence? Now, a kind of knockdown effect of that is that there should be textual support or cited evidence in every single body paragraph of your papers, not only for a literature class, but really for any class. Because anytime you make a claim, there needs to be evidence. A second kind of knockdown effect of this is that there should only be one claim per body paragraph, because each body paragraph is one enthymeme, one claim, and then the job of the rest of that body paragraph is supporting that one claim. If you have another idea in that body paragraph, it actually should be the topic sentence of another body paragraph. If it isn't important enough to do that, it either doesn't need to be in your paper, right, because it's not important enough to be, or you need to figure out how it is actually part of the same idea of, you know, that either it's a clarification of the original point, or if it is a distinction of the original point of that body paragraph, right? You've got to figure out exactly how it fits in, that it isn't a new idea, but it's some kind of modification of the same idea. If you can't do that, if it is actually distinct, then it needs to be its own topic sentence. And if it doesn't deserve that kind of distinction, then it shouldn't be in your paper at all. Okay, other kinds of ways that this might manifest in your paper. One of the ways that you show that your evidence is legit, right, is you have to cite it, right? You have to show not only that it is evidence, you have to show your reader where to find it. Okay, that's part of what makes it evidence, is that it's sourceable, that it's verifiable, that someone else can go and they will find the same thing, and that you're going to give them the little breadcrumb trail in the guise of your citation so that they can look at it for themselves and judge for themselves whether or not you've accurately represented it, or to be a little bit less suspicious about the whole thing so that they can look at it and enjoy it, or kind of draw their own conclusions about it, or read it in context, you know, learn more about it on their own. So this is, you know, the first thing that I just kind of wanted to lay out. A question that I often get very early on in literature classes is, why do papers have to have thesis statements? Why do we have to argue about paper, you know, about readings, or why do we have to argue about literature? And I think two things are going on there. One is a kind of sense, maybe three things. One is a kind of sense that the common use of the word argue, this kind of idea that you have to be kind of tendentious and maybe a little bit aggressive, is maybe leaking into their term, right? And they might be a little bit uncomfortable with this. The next is this kind of sense of maybe a little bit of unease. What if I make a claim about a text that isn't what my teacher wants, and then I'm going to get smacked down? Why do I have to have a point in my paper? What if it's the wrong one? And I would kind of point you back again to that value, that we're open-minded but skeptical. You could flip it around and say we are skeptical but open-minded. One thing that I try to tell my students over and over again to reassure them, because I think there's this kind of weird rumor that goes amongst the students that says, oh man, if you don't feed back to those professors, if you can't suss out exactly what their personal opinions are about the texts, you're done for, right? But the reality is, if you have a claim, if you have a thesis, and then a series of logically building topic sentences that build up to that thesis that are supported by the text, and you build a good case from the evidence in your sources, we're pretty thrilled. Like, that's your job. That's what we're looking at. Can you make a good case from the evidence? And in a literature class, that evidence is typically internal to the text, depending on the class or the parameters of your assignment. You may also have some historical context, secondary texts, or you may have some critical text, so things other academics have had to say about the text. You may even use some theoretical texts, as people in my 250 course too. But what you would be doing is using internal and possibly some external sources. Do you build a good case using that evidence at hand, and without cherry picking, right? Without ignoring things that don't fit. Do you build a good case? If you build a persuasive case, you've done your job. Your job is not to suss out my opinion and then, you know, sycophantically feed it back to me. I know the things I think. I'm excited to hear the things that, you know, that you can argue. But what I really want to see is for you to build a compelling case, right? And that's what you want to do. So yeah, you do have to make an argument. That's what a literary critic does. I think the other thing that might be getting in the way, where sometimes we have students ask, you know, why do I have to have a thesis, is that a lot of times, especially in high school and in some college classes, depending on, you know, who's teaching it and what the assignments are, a lot of times you may have been asked to do what we call a sort of reader response to a text. And that's when you kind of say how you relate to the text or what you thought about the text. And that's largely less a thesis driven paper and more kind of an exploratory personal account. And in many ways, though that may feel personal in some ways and therefore vulnerable, like a kind of vulnerability laden assignment in one way, it doesn't carry with it in some ways the same kind of sense of risk, intellectual risk taking that I think a lot of students feel with a thesis-driven assignment, right? It's a different kind of risk taking. It's a different kind of vulnerability. And in some ways, students feel a little bit safer sometimes with those personal accounts, because if it's about you, it can't be wrong. And they worry that if they're making one of these other types of argument-driven assignments, it can be wrong. And so that feels a lot riskier. Again, I'd drive you to your thesis, as long as it is built logically and with evidence, that's what makes it right. Or, you know, not that there's one secret right answer and, you know, did you throw a dart and hit it, but did you build a strong case for it with the tools at hand? And so I'd like you to really consider that, and hopefully kind of focusing on that method, which we're going to be talking about in future videos, will kind of help assuage some of that anxiety. But I'm both happy, and I guess if it upsets you, I'm sorry to tell you that yes, thesis-driven arguments are kind of the heart of what you will be doing as an English major in these courses, or if any of my future 201 students ever see this as someone writing in an English course. Thesis-driven assignments are where it's at. We make arguments about the text, not about our responses to the text. So just as a heads up, that's a major way to understand or to frame your homework, just to make sure you don't accidentally write the wrong kind of paper. Okay, so I hope that helped. I hope that this also might help to put some of your other assignments and some of your professors' expectations into context. And I'll be making a few more of these in the next few days. So I'll see you then.